My name is Gary Matsuoka, and we're here at Laguna Hills Nursery in Santa Ana. And today's topic will be fixing plants that you buy from stores, retail stores, garden centers before you plant them. So last week, and we'll go over this a little bit, we talked about what is perfect soil. So if you're a farmer, now perfect soil is different for different purposes, but if you're a farmer or a homeowner, if you have a soil that looks like this is sandy loam, which is a good, fine, light-colored soil. That's as good as you can have in your garden. And then if you grow plants in it, virtually anything you plant in it will do fine, as long as you water and fertilize. But unfortunately, the industry, and this is kind of a review of the soil class, is real wanting you to put compost in the ground. And I didn't bring my sample of compost, but compost is basically ground up trees, pulverized in little tiny pieces, and allowed to rot for 3 or 4 months, and then sold as a soil amendment, and sometimes as a soil, or often as a soil too. And it's just not working. And unfortunately, the industry is being told to grow plants in the same thing instead of growing them in this, which we grew plants in the 1950s. And then we were told it was too heavy to lift, so we're supposed to add something to this to make it lighter. And it was supposed to be adding peat to it, which is much lighter material. And peat moss isn't nearly as nasty as ground up trees, because peat moss died as a plant that died perhaps 1,000 years ago and has been sitting at the bottom of a lake decomposing or not decomposing for thousands of years. And when you use this, and it's not also, the other thing about peat moss, it's not related to anything you're growing. So if you use this as a soil replacement, it's not as bad as using ground up wood or ground up bark. So right now, most nurseries have been told to use ground up bark as a soil, or ground up wood of some sort as a soil. And unfortunately, this is decomposing relatively fast because it just died. When you use this and you keep it moist, moist enough for the plant to survive, it can cause a lot of root problems, a lot of root rot, because something that's dead and rotting promotes the conditions that promote root rot. Whereas a good sandy soil, you can keep this as wet as you want. There's nothing in here that promotes the root rot. Root rot, well, let's go over that a little bit, just so we're on the same page. So a typical plant in nature, top up here, roots down here. So when we're talking about soil, we're talking about the roots of the plant. We're creating an environment for the roots. What do the roots want? So the roots need moisture. When the plant's operating, the top of the plant's covered in wax, so it doesn't use water that fast. It does have holes in the leaves that open and close, and when these leaves are open, they bring in the carbon dioxide, and the water escapes. So most plants lose water through holes in their leaves, but essentially the plant's covered in wax, so the rest of the plant doesn't lose much water. The roots are not. The roots are in the ground to absorb the water, so the ground has to be able to store water in it to some extent. So water storage, storage of water is probably number one. But number two, the thing we don't think about, the roots on plants, the leaves make oxygen. It's actually the little green chloroplasts inside the leaves that make the oxygen. The rest of the plant consumes oxygen. The rest of the leaf does, the stems do, the roots do. They're consuming oxygen just like we do to stay alive. So the soil has to be able to Now, unfortunately, like in our bodies, we can breathe through our mouth. The oxygen gets to the tips of our fingers and the tips of our toes because we have a circulatory system. The blood flow distributes the oxygen. Plants don't have that. So each cell has to get air through wherever it is, through the stems. There has to be little holes in the stems to bring the air in, or it has to be able to penetrate the stem of the plant. The roots have to be able to get the air through the roots. Well, the soil then has to be, quote, permeable so the air can get in there. So permeable, which means it allows airflow. Now, we can only hold our breath for maybe 4 minutes max, and after 10, you start losing brain cells. So there's a limit to how little air we can handle. Plants don't respire as fast as people do, or as fast as animals do. So a plant can hold its breath. The roots can hold their breath a lot longer. So we're talking maybe 2 days. But still, they have to get the air in there. So roots breathe oxygen and give off carbon dioxide just like we do. So the leaves create the oxygen, the roots consume it. So the soil has to breathe also. We also mentioned soil should insulate the roots. The root operating temperature is between about 45 to about 85 degrees is the range they'd like to be at. The optimum range for fastest root growth is around 80 degrees. But if you get higher than that, it gets too hot to operate. For stability and support, you got to hold the plant upright. Now, that's about it. I mean, we've taken away nutrition. The soil really, for most plants, the soil is not a source of nutrition. So the soil does the same thing for plants as your house does for you. It's got water storage. We have faucets in the house and stuff like that. We have windows, doors, let the air in and out. It insulates. It keeps, it's stable. We don't eat our house. And for most plants, the way they get nutrition is not through the soil. It's the layer of duff on top of the ground. So duff is dead stuff. I think duff is short for dead stuff. But all the dead leaves and things above the ground break down, and most of them are broken down by either bacteria, and the majority of it is actually broken down by a fungus. There's a fungus in nature. It's called a mycorrhizal fungus. And the mycorrhizal fungus has hyphae, or fungal roots, up in the dead leaves, breaking them down, and the nutrients are transferred directly to the roots of the plants. So 95% of all the plant species known use this system, where the roots of the plants are down here. The fungi go up into the dead space up here, the dead foliage, dead leaves, dead things on top of the ground, manures, things like that, and they break them down and give it back to the plant. Symbiotic relationship. So this zone up here, where the nutrients dead leaves are the main source of nutrition for plants. This is the habitat for what are called saprophytes, the fungi, the bacteria, worms, pill bugs, sow bugs, millipedes, springtails. There's a whole bunch of creatures that eat dead stuff. And when they get done with it, the plants get it back. The mycorrhizal fungus is the main one that most plants use, but almost any of these guys, if they, if the worms eat the leaves, their poop then can become a source of nutrition for the plants. So that's where, the compost layer is where those creatures live. Unfortunately, what's gone on is the industry has told the nurseries, this is what you plant plants in. Because they know that this is a source of nutrition, and mistakenly they tell the nurseries, grow your plants in compost. And unfortunately, what compost tries to do is it tries to eat the roots of the plants. Because that's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to break plant material down and turn it back into nutrition. And if you try to grow the plants in it, they just don't like it. I have some samples of what we mean by that. So this grower, and I won't show the name too closely, puts their plants in what appears to be about 90% ground up wood. I see little red volcanic rock in here, so it's, and there might even be some pieces of sand, but I would say it's at least 80% ground up wood. And the plants came to us looking decent, not great, but decent. This is what we grow. These are both raspberries, and this is what it should look like. But this has gone this route. It's been about 2-3 months since we've had this, and the problem when using wood as a growing medium is that when you water it, it is breaking down. If you keep it bone dry, it may not decompose very fast, but if you keep it moist enough for the plant to be happy, it's breaking down, and as it breaks down, all the things change. Ground up wood tends to store more water. It tends to become less permeable, can't breathe anymore, so the roots start suffocating. Of course, it's not very stable, so plants lean. Before they started growing trees in compost, we didn't sell that many stakes. But since the 1980s, you got to stake up every plant because the soil that they were grown in does this, and they just lean. So if you grew plants in real dirt like we used to, they won't move in this. This doesn't move. It's mostly sand, and sand you got to put a plant in sand. It won't move. But when they're in ground up wood and the wood is decomposing, they're just flopping all over the place. So anyway, that's one example. Same company. We use this company because they grow a lot of neat things. I mean, if they didn't do that, I wouldn't be buying from them. But they grow a lot of neat stuff. But this is a passion vine. Now, passion vines have a reputation on the internet of having to be replaced every 3 years. We think that's how long it takes for the compost to kill it. After 3 years, it's so sludgy in here, or in the ground even. Put this in the ground, after 3 years, it just slimes out the crown of this plant. This is same species of passion vine that we've grown, and you can see what happens. Most indoor plants are in have the same trouble. So most indoor plant growers now use, like this is 100% peat moss. And peat moss, again, it's not so bad initially because at least it's not decomposing that quickly, but it's not permanent. It still breaks down slowly over time and looks like black slime after about a year. It doesn't create toxic conditions except that it doesn't breathe. So after a while, these plants start to look pretty ugly. After a year, you start blaming yourself. You don't blame the nursery that grew it. But here we have some Dracaena starting to show the effects of it. You start getting premature browning of the tips of the leaves. Same with the other plants. You get brown tips on brown edges on the leaves. off color. Here's a plant that we rescued, an indoor plant we rescued. So you can see some of the older leaves are getting real ugly, brown tips all over, off color. But the new growth that came out once we did this is quite nice. In fact, even on plants that are pretty tolerant of the wood in the soil, so this is hibiscus, and they're pretty tolerant of compost as a soil. It doesn't usually kill them, but we took one of these same exact cultivar and put it in our soil a while ago, and you can see it's subtle, but it's there. There's a color difference in the foliage. And also what happens is that in the wintertime, when conditions are bad for tropical plants, the ones in better soil will hold up better than the ones in the compost soil. And we kind of think now we figured out why that is, because when they're in compost soil, the roots tend not to want to be in that area of the root ball. They can't breathe in it, so they're more toward the surface. But when they're more toward the surface, they're not insulated as well in the wintertime, and it puts them to sleep, or it causes more root damage. So in the winter, if they're in this root ball, they'll look worse than when they're in this one. And we see that especially with bougainvillea. Last week we mentioned that the first thing I was taught in the nursery trade is that you do not fool with the roots of bougainvilleas because they're so sparse in the pot. Well, they're so sparse in the pot because they hate the soil they're in. So this is one that is still in the original soil, and you can see the color on it, the size of the leaves. Now that it's mid-November, it's starting to shut down a little bit. It's not blooming as much. Certainly not going to grow, and it's starting to lose some stuff. We got this at the same time and put it in better soil, cut it down to here when we did the change, and we'll talk about that a little later. But you can see what the leaves have done. It looks a lot more vigorous. Not blooming, but it will. So when we change the soil on these, the roots are better insulated. They're not at the edge of the pot, and the plant will continue to grow and thrive throughout the winter months. Winter here not being, say, 60 in the day and 40 at night, and that's not too cold to shut a bougainvillea down. Of course, if you're in Colorado, it'd be dead. So there's a lot of effects in the trade. One of the common problems we see nowadays, we didn't see this 40 years ago, but you plant a boxwood hedge and the plants just decline after 3 or 4 years and start losing branches. That's a root problem. So we hardly sell boxwood anymore. I mean, I can fix this and it'll be fine, and you can buy boxwood and fix the roots, so we'll show you how to do that if you want to really plant them. The other strategy is you buy the plants as small as you can. So at our store, we don't sell that many big plants compared to some nurseries, because the more of the bad soil that comes with the plant, the worse off the plant is. Now, some plants, like this raspberry, even though it's in bad soil, it's not that big an issue, because the way this plant grows, you put it in the ground, the roots aren't staying right here, and the plant's not staying right here. They're migrating. So this plant will migrate out of the terrible soil into your soil, and from that point on, it's fine. So plants like that, no problem. But plants that don't move are in trouble. So it's better to change the dirt on those. So as far as strategy of how to plant plants, Now, just say you have a perfect plant, something that we've grown. Say like this gardenia. We grow gardenias from cuttings because they don't fix well. Now, over the years, we fixed a lot of plants. Take off this dirt, put on better dirt. Hardly lose anything. Gardenias have the biggest loss. So we would lose about 2/3 of the ones that we tried to fix. You know, take one from a famous grower and knock off all the dirt, put our soil on there. They look good for a while. They'd go downhill. Within a year, we'd lose 2/3. And we said, okay, this doesn't like to be, the roots on this plant do not like to be fooled with. So we just, and it turns out, fortunately, that gardenias are probably the easiest plant to grow in the nursery industry. It's just crazy. They're so easy to do from cuttings. You take a piece of branch like this long and stick it in our soil, it grows. Darn thing grows. It's almost like a succulent. So gardenias are one of the easier plants to do if they're in proper soil. In the compost that they grow, you know, the ground up bark, the compost that they're trying to grow them in, it's almost hopeless. They just, you know, after a year, within a year, they're turning yellow, getting the brown tip leaves, losing branch by branch. They never look happy to begin with. I mean, our plants, you know, in the good soil, they're like this. You get them in the bad soil, they're like this. They just don't look good at all. I mean, it's interesting that the health of the roots affects the top that much. And we've also seen when you take a plant out of bad soil, the moment you take it out, it starts to green up, even without any fertilizer. And they perk up too. Just the foliage just perks up. You start taking the compost off the root system, it's like they just start to breathe. You know, they were holding their breath when they're in the compost, and you take that off and suddenly they start to breathe. They look better immediately, at least overnight. Overnight, you see a huge difference. So we do a lot of fixing here. I mean, it's a crime that you have to fix it, but I don't know of any grower. Now, there's a lot of growers I don't know about. So I don't know of any grower that grows plants in containers that grows them in a soil that I like. Again, you get things in real small pots, there's no big issues. That little tiny bit of compost, or, you know, a lot of times it's peat and perlite, and that's fine. But if it's a big pot, bigger container, it's not good. So we don't know of any grower. There are some growers out there that grow plants properly, but most of them are not container growers. So they're growers, and we'll try to bring it in this winter, but there's growers that grow plants in the ground, and then they, you know, in real dirt, and then they dig them up, wrap them, burlap, and send them to us. And that's how, you know, 90% of all the plants in the U.S., or even more than that, 40, 50 years ago, were grown that way. That's because if you grew a plant in a pot, and it was outside in Minnesota, you hit 30 degrees, 20 degrees, this plant's dead. It cannot be in a pot at 30 degrees outside, or 20 degrees outside. But unfortunately, what they found out, you know, they think it's fortunate, but unfortunately they found out if they dig a hole in the ground and stick the pot in the ground, it won't freeze. They don't have to build a greenhouse to save the container plants. They can just stick them in holes in the ground. So now most of the country grows plants in pots. They put them in holes in the ground, and then they sell them when they're ready to sell them, and they grow them in bark. Apparently, bark that's been quickly decomposed for 3 months is then used to grow plants. And the research we've seen is that this is good for a 5-month period. Once you decompose this, it's good for 5 months in a container. And usually, see, the thing about our industry is most of the nurseries in the United States have their plants for 5 months max. That's max. Because they're too cold in the winter. So they bring the plants in around April, and they're out of that nursery by the end of September, because after September they freeze. So they're not wanting them there. So 5 months in bark, they don't see any problems. The plants are gone, they're planted in someone's yard. 2 years down the road, they all start turning like this and get ugly. And they blame themselves. They think plants are too difficult to grow. Everything I touch dies, is what I hear. So it is a problem for industry, but our industry so far has not recognized this as a problem. I've talked to some of the head guys, and they do not recognize that they're selling plants that die. Okay, so if you have a good plant, say you get something we sell, all you have to do is dig a hole that's deep enough so the root ball of this plant, take it out of the pot, the root ball of this plant, you want it to be equal to the soil level with the leaves sticking up like this. Now if it was warm weather, you definitely put a little berm of soil all around it, and once you plant it, you water it real thoroughly right there. And a plant that we grow will work in any soil. It doesn't matter if it's sand, if it's clay, if it's sandstone. This will not cause trouble in the ground. Now the problem we have is if you get a plant with compost around it like this one, the compost, this has air holes in the bottom. So this compost in here can cause trouble because it's decomposing, it's using up oxygen. So the roots aren't breathing very well. And on top of that, if you suddenly cut off the oxygen supply to compost, instead of creating carbon dioxide and water, it starts creating sewer gases, which are toxic to the roots. So you got something poisonous being made. So if you put this directly into a hole, especially if the soil is clay, if you stick this in a hole in the clay, it doesn't breathe. This is using up oxygen faster than the roots can. The roots are suffocating, and then it creates sewer gases on top of that, so it's a double whammy. Roots can't breathe, and it's creating sewer gases. Now, if you don't want to fix this, your option is to make your soil breathe better. So in that case, you would dig a bigger hole, and this soil that you put around the plant, make sure it's got better airflow than the clay did. And you can do that by either mixing it with one of our products like this, our acid mix here. Our acid mix happens to be half volcanic rock and half peat moss. The volcanic rock, which is pumice, well you can use bags of pumice too. This is actually a little better. So pure pumice rock, sorry it's upside down, but pumice rock, white volcanic rock, is about 70% air. Sorry about that.
And then with floss, not floss, moss. Moss worked towards the inside. There was a purpose of putting moss on the top to cool it down. There's no significance towards the ground.
Well, we'll go over that.
Okay.
Okay, so in the soil around this plant, you can mix into the native clay either our acid mix, which is peat moss and pumice rock, or just pure pumice rock, or you can mix in sand if you want. There's no clay soil that won't breathe if you make it half sand. So if you make clay soil half sand, it'll breathe, and the roots can get the air. You can even put pure sand around here. I have one friend who has all the time he's been a landscape contractor, he surrounded all the plants with sand. He says, don't lose them that way. And that makes sense. So even though this soil in here is bad news, the sand, the airflow to it will keep it going. It'll probably usually survive that. unless the grower does a really bad job, and it's, you know, some plants that are more sensitive, like gardenias, still die. If you have a gardenia that's in bark and you surround it with sand, it's still not going to make it. It'll still just turn yellow and give up.
We're speaking of vegetables or just plants?
Anything.
Okay, so my sand is so sandy, it doesn't look like it's worth a hill of beans because my landlady, she had it filled up to an uprising thing. What kind do we need to really fertilize it because it's producing nothing.
If you have sand as a soil, everything will grow in as long as you water and feed it.
Okay.
Sand is almost the perfect growing medium. That was last week's class, though.
That's
Yeah. But yeah, sand is perfect soil for roots. For roots. For root health, sand is perfect. You do have to fertilize it and water it, but beyond that, you got the healthiest roots in the world when you're in sand. Pumice too. So, but anyway, so if you have a good plant, you just stick it in the ground, water it. If you have a bad plant, make sure it breathes all around the sides.
Do you need to loosen the roots when you take it out?
You can. I mean, we'll talk about fixing the plants totally, but that anytime you get rid of some of the soil the grower has on there, it helps, and loosening it does get rid of that too. I mean, it is a matter of size. So when you have, this is essentially a block of compost, the center being the worst area to be in, the sides being not so bad. So most roots on this plant are on the sides. But if you have a root ball that's like this big, boy, it's real bad in the middle of that. You want to make holes through that to get the air in there. Because the thicker that pile of compost is, the harder it is for it to breathe. So this is, this 1 gallon is about the biggest we'd say might survive without having to destroy it. But because the center of the root ball is only about 3 inches from the edge, from the outside edge, whereas you get a 15-gallon filled with bark, that's like 8 inches, 7, 8 inches for the air to go through that compost to get to the middle of that. There's just no way. That center is going to be empty of roots. So on plants that are grown in compost, you got roots at the top, you got roots on the sides, only because there's a gap between plastic. Well, most pots in the sunlight, they expand and contract, expand and contract. So there's kind of an air gap between the pot and the root ball in the soil ball. So the roots tend to go to the sides. Certainly there's air holes at the bottom. When you drop that in the ground, there are no more air holes in the bottom. So that's why we have to do this. Now, we don't like to amend the soil or modify the soil below the root ball, especially on the bigger plants.
Trees?
Yeah, especially trees.
Oh, okay.
Because if you soften it up down there and you water it, sometimes it oozes around the side, the tree sinks down. And you certainly don't want to change the level of the soil on a tree. On plants like raspberries, you can bury the stems like this and they'll grow out of the stems. But trees, the trunk just rots if you bury it, so it's better not to bury it much at all. So make sure that doesn't happen. On bigger trees, when you plant bigger box trees, even if the soil that the box tree comes in is fine, the problem is these roots are deeper than they're supposed to be. So in nature, I've dug many plants out of the ground, and to either to remove them or to transplant them, you don't find roots below a foot. And the reason for that is the air doesn't penetrate below a foot, unless you've got gravel for dirt, or you got a lot of rocks like in the bottom of a river gorge. Root systems barely go below a foot deep.
Are we understanding roots as the big ones or the little small ones, the veins maybe?
You didn't come to last week's class.
Oh,
So there are no such thing as a taproot. They don't occur in nature generally unless you have gravel for soil. But generally roots on plants live in the top foot of soil or less. The mycorrhizal fungi that are the symbiotic partner of plants, a lot of times we mistake them for plant roots. They said that we're told by the U.S. Forest Department or the Ag Department, I can't remember which one it was, that 80% of the roots of a tree are actually the fungus strands from the mycorrhizal fungus. They're not the roots of plants at all. So 80% of what we thought were the roots of a plant are actually the mycorrhizal fungus that are the partners. So the plant roots are more or less the bigger ones that you see, and all those a lot of the tiny ones are fungi roots. But anyway, so the 24-inch box usually has a 20-inch, 22-inch root ball, too deep. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Ag Department, sent us notices 20 years ago telling us, actually it might have been longer than that, it might have been 30 years ago now, do not add anything to the soil. They already realized that adding amendments is bad. But put in these drain pipes with holes in them. On all sides of this root ball, so that we can get air to the bottom of that root ball. Keep the roots alive. Again, instead of pipes, you can put a whole bunch of pumice in the ground so the air can get all the way to the bottom of the hole. Some way to keep those roots alive, because the containers are too deep. They should make containers a lot shallower. I mean, for a while, instead of buying the 24-inch boxes that are 24 inches wide and 24 inches tall, we had our supplier make a shallower box, but it's a pain. Cost way more. You know, we made it 18 inches high and 28 inches across, but it costs too much, so we went back to the 24s. But just remember, of course, we do have our very pumicey soil. You know, the soil we use ourselves has a substantial amount of pumice rock in it. So even though it's maybe 20 inches deep, it probably does breathe even without these pipes, because our soil is so airy.
And the interest is in the oxygen.
It's the oxygen. We're not caring about the water.
No, sir.
So a lot of people think that these pipes are for water, they're for air, or the roots have to breathe. Okay, so that's installing plants as is. Now, fixing plants before you install them, that's what we'll look at next here. So the most gentle way to do it is with water, but it does take a lot of water to take soil off of plants, and since we're kind of back in a drought again here without rain this year, it's better just to do it a different way. Now, normally we would do this on the sidewalk. This table is a little bit soft, so it may not work here as well. But one of the methods that my son invented is interesting. Is what I would do, what I was taught to do when I was taught to do this, is take an ice pick and just carefully go between the roots. Try not to break the roots. And of course, it would take you like an hour to do one plant.
And that's how the way a bonsai tree is taken care of too, probably alongside.
True.
Yes,
Well, my dad used chopsticks
yes, sir.
to remove the dirt and change the soil. Now, what I'm going to do automatically on this plant, because flowers use a lot of water and a lot of energy, well, I'll just cut off the flower stalk. So take off that stress. But so I was having my son work on some citrus trees, and we've never lost a citrus tree taking the soil off of it. They're pretty sturdy plants. So I told him to use the stick method and take it off the roots. Well, after about 2 hours he was working on about 20 trees, I hear this banging outside. And instead of using the stick to carefully pry off the dirt, he's doing this. Just dropping on the cement. And I was going to go over there and yell at him, and I go, well, let's just see how this turns out. So when you drop it on the cement, it like takes 2 minutes or 1 minute to take all the dirt off of a 5-gallon root ball. And he potted them all up real quick. Didn't lose any. So I said, okay, that's a new method. Faster method of taking the soil off the roots. So now we do it too. Again, water's more gentle, but it might take 2 or 3 gallons of water to take this off. Now some people have said, well, you put water in a bucket and you just dunk it in there and you can do it that way and save on water. I'm not a fan of that. We did that for a little bit. We started getting a lot of root rot problems. And I think, you know, when you dunk things in water, if there's root rot on the roots, it gets in the water. And you transfer it to the next plant, next plant, next plant, so they all get the same disease if you're using the same water. So if you want to wash it off, just wash it off onto your lawn or to a flower bed and don't reuse the water. Just use the water to water something, but don't reuse it because we think, you know, if the plant's having trouble. So, I mean, I've been emailing, I emailed earlier this year with a professor from Berkeley, and they're trying to figure out why all the replanting of native plants along the highways was failing, and their conclusion was the plants they're getting from the growers already had root rot problems. The roots were already infected with disease. So I emailed him, I saw the article, and so I emailed him and said, yeah, it's the recycled wood products that are causing that problem. He says, I concur. They shouldn't be using ground up dead trees. So most of the native plant growers, you look at their soil that they use, it's big chips, small chips, all chips of wood in there, wood and bark, all this compost. To make it so it drains better, they put in bigger pieces, it seems. And that kind of holds back the problem of root rot for say a month or so before that wood rots too, and then it causes more root problems.